whole idea of this session is more of a coffee chat conversation. Russ looks so surprised about being a moderator of this.
I'm glad to be here moderating.
That's right. Do you have your microphone, Andre? You do. All right, perfect. I think this session is going to be a bit like a dance. So whoever decides to lead, they lead, and then we follow in the conversation. We're talking about AI in China, Europe, and the US. And I think everyone in the audience is really interested and wants to find out what the differences are, what similarities are, what should we be paying attention to. It's a coffee chat conversation, so I guess we just sit back and talk about things. I came back from China last week. I live in Australia. I have a bit of an insight on that. That's the end of my lead role for this one, but I thought maybe we actually should say a few things about ourselves. Russ, did you want to start?
I think that's a great idea. Hello, everyone. My name is Russ Wilcox. I chair the Policy Committee for the American Society for AI. I was responsible for helping draft America's AI Action Plan. I do a variety of work advising members of Congress, the United States Senate, a variety of departments on how do we actually implement ethical AI policy. In addition to that, I work closely with European allies to facilitate track 2 dialogue in these geopolitically interesting times to ensure that despite differences, we can still find common ground across AI policy. And very excited to be here. And then I will pass it over to Andre to give a quick introduce himself.
Yes. Hello, everybody. So it's great to be with Russ and Marek. So my name is Loesekrug-Pietri. I'm running the Joint European Disruptive Initiative, which is an agency for advanced research and frontier technology. So we fund high risk, high reward technology bricks. The mission is to make sure that Europe and free societies remain top of the game in emerging technologies. So to give you some examples, we have a program on finding alternatives to rare earths. We have a program on antimicrobial resistance. We have a program on reducing by 3 orders of magnitude the energy needs for inference on AI. We have currently a program on self-deployable structures in space. You could think about what are the whole projects of database in space. We do that pan-European. For us, Europe is EU 27 plus the UK, plus Switzerland, plus Norway. And with us, no calls for proposals. So we try to debureaucratize the whole research and technology environment. So we set a clear mission, reduce by or increase by 10 times the energy density of a storage system, of a battery. And then we reach out to the best teams in Europe from science, from deep tech, and from industry, so excellent matters, and we try to do in 1 to 2 years what a normal research program would do in 5 to 10 years. So the model that we get inspired from is the DARPA model, and this exists, so JEDI exists since 2.5 years. The idea is a bit older, and we are now 7,500 all over Europe, and even if I'm half French, half German, so pick the side you dislike the less. We have a non-centralized structure, so we have hubs in 43 innovation hubs all over Europe, including in Poland. And last but not least, we have very deep relationship with innovation agencies all over the world, including the different ARPAs and DARPAs in the US. So I like when Russ is talking about allies. That's the way to go.
Amazing, and I think just your comments, Andre, facilitate a great conversation that spans data sovereignty, chips. How do we even start the beginnings of conversation in this environment? But before we do that, Marek, would love to have you introduce yourself.
Sure, thank you. Thanks, Russ. So I'm Marek Kowalkiewicz. I'm based in Australia. I'm a professor and chair in digital economy at QUT Business School, Queensland University of Technology. I work a lot with public sector, helping governments, local, state, federal governments understand how they can serve their citizens better. And behind that is trying to understand how technology can support that. I started teaching artificial intelligence 25 years ago. I spent 10 years working for a large German organization called SAP. I was a co-creator of SAP's machine learning lab in Singapore, did quite a lot of research in the AI space as well, but at some stage decided I want to be sort of independent from a particular vendor and just work with any vendors, but on solving problems. So I think it's really interesting for me to be in this conversation, because the conversation is about Europe, the US, and China, and I live in neither of those places. I'm the external in Australia. Having said that, I was born in Poland, lived in Poland, I lived in China, I lived in the US, so I kind of have this funny mix of being an external, but also sort of understanding the culture a tiny bit. So I think that's going to be exciting.
Awesome. So I have to call out Andre's great hat, Make Europe Great Again. I love that. As a European at heart, it does me well to see that. So one of the interesting top trends that I've been following is not only data sovereignty, but technical sovereignty coming out of the Nordics and greater Europe. Traditionally, there have been kind of two primary superpowers when it comes to AI and large language models, with US leading in terms of frontier models, OpenAI, Anthropic, and now you start to see China bridging that gap, not only in terms of DeepSeek, but their full stack implementations of architectures, chips, data centers, right? But a third path is now emerging, partially due to the geopolitical environment we're in, where Europe and the Nordics are starting to build out their own large language models, their own technologies. How does that impact global economies? How can we still collaborate while retaining some of the sovereignty that makes us unique without leading to more or less a World War I style nationalistic race of AI arms? What are some of the trends you're seeing in Europe?
Okay, we won't solve the geopolitical issues in a couple of minutes, but a few thoughts. Indeed, first, what is striking is, people love to criticize Davos, but I'm going to say some nice words. It is in this place that actually already 40 years ago, there was this recognition, and we need to admit that was pretty far-reaching, that no problem is purely business, no problem is purely political, no problem is purely, I would say, civil society, NGO, no problem is purely communication, outreach. Everything is interdisciplinary. And that was a little bit the basic idea of this forum, of bringing these categories together. And today we realize that those who still think in silos actually only see part of the problem. That's also a challenge, because for most of us to be interdisciplinary, and I'm more coming from the scientific side, when you look at the world of today, the true disruptions, be it geopolitical or be it scientific, they happen at the intersection of disciplines. A good example is linked with AI, is the Nobel Prize in Chemistry that was attributed 2024 to Demis Hassabis and one of his colleagues at DeepMind and a third person. He got a Nobel Prize in chemistry for computer scientists on a topic linked with biology, which is and life sciences, which is protein folding. If you think about Elon Musk, that you like him or not, I mean, he's obviously a genius entrepreneur, that for sure. Is today Tesla? For a long time, the German auto companies thought that he's an automaker. Actually, he's more a software developer, and that is also making his strength. Is today Starlink a satellite company? Well, today the telecom operators are realizing that actually he will become probably one of their biggest competitor very soon, now that he has spectrum and relatively low latency, the more he gets his satellite down. So this capacity of thinking interdisciplinary is absolutely critical. There was a long introduction. Regarding AI, is by definition the transversal tool, because number one, it's a capacity of making sense of this exponential rise of data. I remind, in 2010, we had 2 terabytes of data from mankind's beginning to now. Now, in 2020, we were already at 20, and we expect in 2030 to be at 200, 250. So we are in a true exponential moment. So AI comes at this moment to make sense of an increasingly complex world. And the second thing is we realize how much it's linked with prosperity. When you look at the US, you know it much better than me, Russ. If you take the tech giants, they are the ones driving US growth since 10 years. If you take them away, growth is pretty flat. So it's absolutely essential to master that. Now, there is a huge difference between autarcy, so doing everything by yourself, and being dependent. We realize that it's so mission critical for data science, for healthcare, for of course now increasingly for defense, that you need to be able to have a control on your destiny, not just in order to protect yourself, but in order to have also a sound relationship. And maybe that's my little angle with the cap. The cap is not here to say we are the best and we are going to disconnect from the rest of the world. But I think too often Europe has forgotten that it needs to have a strategic, long view and go beyond, I would say, the pure, I would say, common market, and it needs to think a little bit more long term, and the political project behind it is how do in democracies we combine capacity of having checks and balances in a regular way, that's called elections, and on the other side a capacity of investing long term. And my last point here is when you think about the key success factors of tomorrow for AI, it's clearly the case. It's technology, research, and education. And if you don't have a long view, and if we're not capable of having this long view in Europe, the risk that increasingly, well, we'll do what we do today is we all expect at 2:30 the speech of Donald Trump who is setting the agenda. How do we set again our own agenda? That's the goal.
I think if, Andrea, you mentioned the aspect of control. So I was in China for the past 2 weeks. Something interesting happening there, right? So, you arrive in China.
You were teaching there?
No. I was just holidaying. That was just a trip. And so I was in China. You arrive in China, and if you don't use a VPN, which is not something that you should be using in China, if you're a person in China, you do not have access to OpenAI's ChatGPT. You do not have access to Anthropic's Claude, and so on and so on. Right? Those models, those foreign main models, are not available in China. You have access to Chinese-made models like DeepSeek and QN and so on and so on. So there's protectionism there, right? What I found interesting is when I looked into some of the stats, there was one that was absolutely mind-blowing. So there's a possibility to analyze how globally, how much every given large language model is being used. It's a bit of a statistical way of analyzing packets of data and so on, but you can do that. So end of 2024, December 2024, the Chinese-made large language models accounted for 1.2% of global use of large language models, right? So like a blip on a radar, nothing significant. End of 2025, I'm going to give you two numbers, 13 and 30, 13 and 30. 13 was the average use of Chinese LLMs globally after 12 months, from 1.2 to 13. And in some weeks, and I don't really understand why that was happening, in some weeks, the use of China-made large language models was at 30%. So we have a country with, what's the current number, 1.4 billion people or so, that is not allowing access to models from the outside, but it's also flooding the world with their own models, right? Mm-hmm. So I'm fascinated by it. And to me, the question is what happens in the next 12 months, right? I have some answers why I believe, this is happening, but I think we should just be chatting. So, what do you guys think?
Yeah. Now we want to know the answer. So you need to tell us. But
look, remember when I was a kid, I had all those plastic toys made in China, all those products made in China, right? It was a strategy that started in the 80s to pretty much flood the world with, cheap goods that were of a reasonably good quality. They weren't perfect, but they all were also not falling apart on the first day, right? So fast, cheap, faster, better, not better, faster, cheaper, and more, right? Flood the market. I think it's similar. It's a similar situation with large language models at the moment. Chinese models are just slightly subpar when you compare them to the US, like at 90% capability at this stage, some less. I don't think any are more capable. But for a lot of use cases, that's good enough. That's all that you need. If all you need is summarize a document that was sent to you, maybe you can use that model. And those models made in China are either open source or they're very, very cheap. And so, while everyone in the US is trying to make money on, better, more capable models that are expensive, China is taking a different strategy and flooding the market.
Agreed, and I think those are some trends that we're seeing. I think everyone knows about the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative, where from about 2009 moving forward, the Chinese government would seek to improve infrastructure, building out in developing countries critical needs, right? What we're starting to see now is that same digital Belt and Road Initiative coming into play. In fact, 23 countries have been highlighted by China as in need and ranked in 3 tiers of digital architecture. So not just supplying them with large language models, but looking at the full stack from chips to data centers to full scale integration. And to put that into perspective, right, going into the United States portion, right, under President Joe Biden, he began to sanction chips, right? And when you restrict a resource to compete in the global economy, what's that going to happen? Is someone going to pull out? No, they are going to innovate. And so several weeks ago, there was an announcement that China pulled out of H200 chips. And everyone was shocked to say this. And we start asking why. It's because they don't need those chips anymore. They're starting to build their own ecosystems. And in fact, with the CHIPS Act in America, we are looking at building more chips, but chips are just silicon wafers. Yeah. You have to get them to talk to each other during a process called packaging. Asia contains 97% of the chip packaging. So even if we built chips in America, we still have to send them to Asia to get packaged and to come back. So at the end of the day, what we're having is not only the great export of Chinese large language models, but Chinese technology to countries where you made the analogy of maybe the quality's not so great, but for developing countries that need access to this, think Global South. What's better, spending millions and millions and millions of dollars on NVIDIA H200 and risk tariffs, or go into a slightly lower tier quality and build up but have an ecosystem around that? So what does that look like from the European perspective?
I think we can learn a lot of things. I mean, let me start first with the bright part. When you look at how Europe, we are in the Polish house, when you look at people like 11 Labs, when you look like Black Forest Labs, when you look like Mistral, and they were started from university, from fantastic people, be it the multimodal aspects that you see in Germany or in Poland, the very science and mathematically grounded models from the French side. You still see that betting big in fundamental research and education is absolutely critical. And what people can do with just a couple of hundred people in all of these 3 and still be at par in terms of performance, that is the really bright spot. Then I think we can learn a lot of things out of China. I mean, there's often this what bothers me a bit, and that's going to be a little bit unpolitically correct, is how much, I mean, we don't talk so much about Aleph Alpha anymore in Germany, but it will always strike me that 1.5 years ago, Aleph Alpha raised 400 million with Schwarz in particular. The same day, the Handelsblatt and Loesekrug in France was titling on the fundraising of Mistral. Handelsblatt was doing a whole title on their front page saying Aleph Alpha, the AI company that whole Europe should support. So basically right now what we are doing is not what the Chinese have been doing. The Chinese are extremely good at having intense competitions within the country, so that then the best player emerge, and then this best player, best athlete, you could say, is then the one that is conquering the world. I still see, and as a French, that's the controversial part, I'm annoyed when I see that the French government becomes the main salesman of Mistral. It should be the salesman of 11 Labs. It should be the salesman of Black Forest, because otherwise the risk we are taking is that we bet everything on one player, and we hope he will win. But unless the market has decided that he's really able to have continental scale and be ready for the world market, the risk is that we keep the fragmentation. That's point now, and that's that's the Chinese playbook. When you look at what happened in telecom, was the same story between ZTE and Huawei and the others. The competition was probably much worse than what Margaret Vestager would have ever dreamt of. But once the best player, in this case Huawei, emerged as the clear winner, then it was the one that was basically sent to conquer the world, starting with Africa, but now increasingly Europe. You probably saw that now the Europeans are backtracking of having a Chinese equipment in their telecom system, but it's probably a little bit late now that they are in the basic infrastructure. So I think this playbook is probably learning for us. The other thing is the deployment. I think we all talk about these models. Now, where really it's going to be critical is how it's going to be able to be deployed in companies. And on that one, I think the jury is really out, because a lot of CEOs are seeing, I mean, all these ARRs of the big AI companies, they come from somewhere. That means big companies are using it, paying licenses. But now what we need is to make sure that this translates into real business opportunity. And we all know today that there's a big question mark, and you hear that in Davos, about what is the concrete impact. Because what people don't realize is that you can have Copilot or others on your desktop, but actually it should be combined with a transformation of organization. It's not just a tool that comes on top of that. And that is still something that not a lot of companies have figured out.
And I love how you said that, a tool on top of something, but also looking at how China approaches their culturally unique way of competition, right? And so if you actually look at source Chinese documents, when they talk about artificial intelligence, it's quite different. Artificial intelligence, at least from the American perspective, means that you are building something on top of something. So think of a smart TV, right? You can have all of the apps on it, and it's intelligent, but built on something. What happens if the internet goes down? Well, you still have the TV, but those apps don't work, right? So there's something artificial on top of it. But if you look at the Chinese documents, they are actually referred to artificial intelligence as intelligence, period. Meaning that they're integrating this with all of their systems. So it's both a very unique cultural perspective on the exportation of this technology based on linguistic perspectives. But this brings us into a really fun topic that we were having a discussion before, where that layer of artificial intelligence creates inefficiencies within the public sector, right? How many times have you worked with your local government official or state government official, filed a permit to build something in your house, and they say, 10 years it'll take to put this deck on your porch, right? So there's still this reticence of accepting AI within government functions, partially, I think, due to the promotion in some cases of some models or the other. But Marek, tell us a little about what you've seen in the public sector when you start talking about the implementation of AI.
People in the public sector are trying to avoid even mentioning that AI is being rolled out at the moment, simply because, you know, the public vibe is changing, right? There's a lot, you don't hear it here in Davos, but sort of leave Davos, drive out for an hour and say AI, and people will say, we're losing jobs, you know, hallucinations, whatnot, all sorts of problems, right? On the way here, you know, Qantas has a entertainment system on the planes, and there are all those movie categories that are sort of looking at your, you know, romance and horror, and now there's a new category called AI Doom, right? There's a category of movies on airplanes now, AI Doom. Or gloom and doom, I don't know. It's absolutely, you know, shocking, right? So point number one, public servants are trying to avoid mentioning the fact that AI is being deployed. That doesn't mean that they're trying to avoid deploying AI, but they're really, really careful at finding the right use case and making sure that, you know, it's a sound implementation. AI is just a tool. You know, I was just thinking when you were talking about what happens in Davos, I thought, if this was not AI, but like, I don't know, mobility, imagine all those banners here in Davos that say, you know, AI ROI and so on. Think about if this was a mobility topic, everyone would have banners like internal combustion engine, right? Like this is just a motor. This is just a thing inside. This is just a drivetrain. Really what matters is the change. Now, I'm going to bring Australian perspective for a second. I know it's not in the title, but I think it's quite relevant here. So a few years ago in Australia, the federal government, one of the agencies, deployed an algorithm that was meant to identify people who received support from the state, but should not have received that support from the state. And somebody, created those categories. It was not like a machine learning model. It was more a bit like an expert system model, right? Still, in my world, this is AI, just a slightly different type of AI. This was a wrong algorithm. The way it was created, those people didn't realize that it would actually create a lot of false positives. Mm-hmm. And by a lot, I mean hundreds of thousands, up to 4 million false positives at some stage. But there was no human in the loop. So people started receiving letters from a robot saying you have to return money that you owe to the government. Imagine what could have happened. And look, I wrote about it a lot. Tragic situations. People committing suicide was one of the outputs of that situation. Look up Robodebt. Mm-hmm. Robodebt, this is the biggest case of algorithmic failure, massive payouts to citizens. In Australia, everyone is worried of talking about automation because the word Robodebt surfaces all the time. So there's a lot of cultural work. There's a lot of work on trust at the moment. That's why there's a lot of hesitance of mentioning AI.
Yeah. I think going into this, you brought up some really interesting points around the role of policy within artificial intelligence. I think we're all in agreement here is that this technology definitely needs to have safeguards, right? We don't want it going out and finding new ways of pattern matching to create biological weapons or have high use cases where a child has suicidal ideation and the LLM helps it, right? So in the US side, we have kind of two major competitive frameworks. First, we have the federal government, whose primary role is to project its influence on the world. So, of course, the goal is how do we expose American AI to the world? However, in the United States, we almost have 50 different countries. And we have 50 different sets of regulations coming up that are at odds with innovation. Why? Because the state's role is to protect its people. And one of the big portions that I've been noticing, especially when we're talking about humans in the loop, and I want to extend that to something called technologists in the loop with legislation. There was a piece introduced in the United States called the US AI Civil Rights Act. I don't know about you. I think that sounds great, right? But if you look at the definition of artificial intelligence, and I kid you not, this was the definition. An algorithm of sufficient complexity.
Sufficient.
Sufficient, without defining sufficient. And it was so broad that it would require high school teachers to audit their training data they give to their students to do linear regressions for homework, right? I don't know about you, but that has no place in innovation and does nothing to protect a student, rather adds in regulatory hurdles. So this is the balance we have to bring. So in the US perspective, at least at the federal government, there is more emotional policy being made rather than intelligible policy coming out of technologists. But I'm going to go to the Australian and European perspectives, right? Because we had the EU AI Act, which of course had its proponents and opponents, but I think we can agree that it was a good starting place. There were technologists in the room. We might not agree on everything, and this was a good start, right? I would love to hear more. What is the role of technologists now in the legislative process to ensure that these pieces of policy coming out don't bite us in the butt 3 years from now with poor definition? So I'd love to hear the European perspective and the Australian perspective.
Yeah, I'm happy to talk. I mean, I hoped we would avoid the regulation part, but I think it's unavoidable.
Go ahead, complain.
No, I'm not going to complain, but I think if we take a little bit of step back, first, it's a very old story. The role of technology and scientists in politics. If you remember, there's a very famous book by Bertolt Brecht on Galilei. You know, Galilei was the one who basically, with Giordano Bruno before, discovered that the Earth is not anymore in the center of the universe, but it was the sun. So imagine that was actually shaking I would say, the power of the church and of the whole value system that was built around it. So he had this hesitation, should I say that with the risk of disrupting the whole society? But I think it's important that in free societies, scientists speak up and that we at least master these technologies. And that's the challenge for our regulation. If you try to do regulation in a world where today there is no truth anymore, and I'm not now celebrating fake news, but what I want to say, and we saw that during the pandemic, scientists, and had a difficulty of time of saying that, had to say, well, we actually don't exactly know how the virus is transmitted. We realized that, initially we all had this gel, and we realized that actually it's not transmitted through hands, but through different means. And this was not very well explained, which actually created a lot of uncertainty about what science is. We have to realize that science is permanently hypothesis that you validate, and science evolves. And now let me come to regulation. If you begin to have a regulation which is so strict, what we call ex ante, from the beginning, the risk is obviously that number one, you curtail innovation, but also that actually you will not, as a free society, master this technology. There's another very famous example. In 1939, there's this letter by Einstein, who was a pacifist, an arch-pacifist, who's the one that with a Hungarian physicist, Szilard, wrote this letter to Roosevelt saying, well, the Nazis are working on this heavy water. We don't know exactly, but there might be an incredible energy released by splitting atoms. And this is what created the Manhattan Project. Afterward, of course, Einstein was not very happy to see what it produced. But I think we can still be happy that it was the US and not the Axis that kind of developed these kind of technologies. So I think, fast forward, when you see the potential impact of AI, it's super important that we, as free societies, remain top of the game. But to have permanently technologists and scientists in the political process that we can permanently then assess what are the possible consequences. And my last point will be on something very topical for Poland, for Europe, for the world, which is Ukraine. Look at how until 2022, in my country, France, we said, we don't want automatic weapons. This is impossible. All these guardrails are gone through the window now that we have the Ukrainian story. So how do you make sure that you remain top of the game, that you use the best of the possibilities while still understanding the process? And on that one, I would be a little bit critical of the European system, because when you look at the legislative body, we have not yet found the magic formula of having both politicians with the legitimacy of a vote, parliamentarians, executive branch, while involving in a smart way the scientific academies, the technological ecosystem. We are seen as competition. You permanently see the deep tech ecosystem that is complaining about the AI Act. Do you have the MPs who are complaining that these guys don't understand the moral ground? We need to find the right combination between the public side and involving increasingly technology and science. And when you realize how technology is now fundamental to not only economy, but geopolitics, it's an obvious one, but also to the future of democracies. I mean, 50% plus of people under 25 create their political opinion online. So we need to make sure that we have technology embedded in our, I would say, value and a democratic system and in our laws.
So there's something that I want to hop on after I get to Marek, because I want to hear the Australian perspective, right? Is this concept of truth and truth given artificial intelligence. And I have an interesting story to kick that off of. But before that, Marek, what are you seeing from the Australian side?
Yeah. And truth, we'll talk about it, right? Philosophers have spent thousands of years trying to understand what truth is. So that's going to be fun. Looking forward to that part. But look, on the legislation part, and look, I'll precede my answer by saying that I don't have a strong view. I'd rather want to explore some thoughts here, okay? So first of all, EU AI Act. I get it. It might be slightly too prescriptive in some areas, but I think it's actually good that Europe has actually moved quite fast on that. And let me explain why. I believe that constraints are a catalyst of creativity. Constraints are a catalyst of innovation. If you're an artist and you tell yourself, I'm only going to use 3 colors, that might lead to something really interesting. All right? And I could expand on those examples, but you get my point, right? Now, move to Australia. Australia is actually pretty late to the game when it comes to regulating AI. The perspective has been, well, we believe the existing regulatory framework might already apply to AI. Perhaps that's true, right? Like I said, I'm exploring it. Perhaps that's true. But you know what? EU AI Act, whether people like it or not, is a beautiful artifact to look at and say, hey, this is what the Act says. This is, the types of AI systems that we should be dealing with in this way. These are the types of the AI systems that we should be dealing with that way. Once you have that, you could actually start thinking about your organization and what you do in your organization. We don't have that in Australia, right? A lot of businesses are AI illiterate, and they don't have that artifacts that they could have a look at and say, well, maybe we disagree with it, maybe it's a constraint, but we're gonna, comply, right? It's not there. So there's a lot of self-regulation that has to happen in Australia because there's no other choice, right? And then, throw in the US perspective, and we all know the sort of the initial permissionless innovation, right? Where every organization could pretty much do whatever they wanted, and we know what happened in the social media world. I think there's a risk that a lot of that might be happening in the AI world now, where the sort of the incentives for the digital giants are not exactly aligning with the values of the society. Right? So I think there's a role for the government. But like I said, in Australia, we're still developing that, and I'm still exploring this space.
Okay, I promise I'm getting away from the policy speech now. I had
Let's
to
talk
tackle
about
this
truth.
a minute. Yes. So last September, I was invited by the U.S. State Department to go to the United Nations General Assembly. 3 weeks after that, I had a kung fu competition. I've been doing martial arts since I was a kid.
A kung fu competition.
Yes, yes. That'll be a whole conversation for another day.
Sitting in the wrong spot
and
here.
so I'm flying back from the UN, and I asked Claude, my favorite LLM, to come up with a training plan with me. And it comes up with just these general prescriptive, on day 3 do this, day 4 do this. And I said, Claude, I appreciate the feedback. And I said, well, being someone who's built large language models, it's like an intern. It will do a good job. Sometimes it'll hallucinate, but it's up to you to give it better context. So I step back and say, let me give it some better context. And I think, who does martial arts that might have a similar schedule to me, right? The first two people that came to mind were famously Vladimir Putin, who does judo, and then Mark Zuckerberg, who does jujitsu. And I am no way saying that I am a world leader or in that class, but I am closer to their distribution than the average software developer that the schedule would give me. So I tell Claude that, and it immediately comes back to me and says, Russ, I'm concerned for your mental well-being. You are having viewpoints of grandiosity. We need to have a conversation. And it pulls up a therapist's phone number. And I say, okay, I see what's going on here. I need to give it evidence. So I pull out my invite that was given by the State Department, and I put it into Claude. And it responds back even further, saying, Russ, you are having a mental health emergency. You are having a psychotic break. You're making up invites, right? Because I was so far out of distribution. And what's happening in this case is that these models are pattern matching, right? And if you go deep enough, it's no longer about hallucinations. It's about what is true or what is not true, because you can start pattern matching and come up with whatever statistics you want, and it's very hard to validate. So from a technological perspective, how do we start thinking about that within our society, within our youth who are engaging with AI consistently, with individuals, say, who are doing deep research on a niche aspect of history around Nazism that then just gets cut off, right? And I had this blog that was written that says, China limits what you speak because you can't talk about Tiananmen Square and some of the other stuff in DeepSeek, and America makes you doubt because these models, albeit they have good intent to profile for psychiatric harm, will start to introduce the self-doubt. And create a challenge around what I call cognitive sovereignty. So what is the role of human thinking in these AI systems, and how can we start mitigating the impact of AI on human thought as these technologies become more ubiquitous?
Maybe starting with a little bit of sober recognition. I think we all talk about creative destruction. I mean, that was the Nobel Prize on economics of this year, and we are very proud because one of the recipients is part of our board at JEDI, Philippe Aguillon. He's here in Davos. The one thing that maybe this is missing in the case of AI is what is happening in all our organization is that basically today the models, the Claude, the Mistral, the OpenAI, people estimate that they are able to replace our hard competencies. So are we at 2 years, 3 years of experience of a young lawyer, of a financial analyst, of a marketing consulting, etc.? That's probably where we are. And so we see already a two-tier society between those who are able, and that was exactly your point, Russ, is the capacity of prompting it the right way. So asking the right question. If you take a step back, what is it about asking the right question? It's what a scientist does all the time, is he emits an hypothesis, and the most brilliant scientists were the ones who came with the most crazy or the most disruptive hypothesis. By the way, in the US, not everything is gloomy in my side. The Department of Energy, the new Undersecretary of Science, has launched this Genesis program, which is how you turbocharge science with AI. And I think AI will allow us to ask totally unhuman questions, so things that we not even think about, so expand our horizon. But let me close that. So asking the right, and when you think about what is, I would say, the ultimate, I saw in these categories in Davos, people ask you, are you CEO, are you consultant, are you chairman, etc. Well, who is on the board is today basically those who are conducing the strategy of a company. And what is a good board member? It's not a guy who is going to tell the CEO what to do. It's going to be the guy who is going to challenge with the right questions the management. And so we come to the point where the key in this world is, are you able to ask the right question? Are you able to understand what matters? And I think the dilemma in which we are today is, how do you get people basically fast tracking them from coming right out of school to a moment where they have enough experience to ask the right question and to take the maximum out of these tools. And I think this is something which is a major societal issue for us, because the risk we have is that we'll have a generation, those who have 1, 2, 3, 4 years of experience, those come out of university, school, etc., that might be, in this case, radically eliminated by AI. And I think that is already happening. You probably see all these, I think Capgemini just announced that they're reducing massively their workforce. So that is going to be a challenge. And I think this is the question we should, as a society, ask. One last point I want to make on regulation still. What it makes me think of, it's not a question of having scientists or elected officials. What we need to recognize is that speed is more important than ever. You can have the best regulation, but if technology evolves so quickly, that means that we also in our free societies need to adapt the speed in which we regulate. It was a fantastic regulation, very forward-looking, 4 years ago when it was started. But since it took us 2.5 years or 3 years to put it in place, and when we started, the LLMs did not exist. It was pre-November 2022. We had, to kind of revamp the regulation to be adapted. So how do democracies become much faster in their regulation process? If we solve that, then we're able to inject our values.
And that's one of the concerns that I have coming up, which is this concept of digital feudalism, right? Because I really believe that there are two paths forward for the West, right? From China's perspective, things are faster, right? You have the argument that they're authoritarian and whatnot, but that's not fully true. They're more of a meritocracy in terms of how their political structure is built. But the West is...
They used to be. I think Xi changed that.
Yes, I agree. And I'm not in no way being a China apologist. I'm putting that on record. I am a well-loving American. want to be European.
Chinese camera and the US camera are watching you.
Yes, yes. Hello there.
two cameras there.
But the question that I have, the concern that I have coming out of the United States is exactly what you said. You have corporations cutting down on entire departments because it's not just going to be AI. It's one human or two humans running AI systems that create this feudalistic structure. Secondly, we have an education system that was built for the industrial age, right? If you even look at the times at which students go to school, for factory workers, right? So does AI need to just completely reconstruct how we operate as a society? And how do we do that at a rate where we no longer have to worry about the separation of classes at a massive rate?
So I think we're getting kicked off stage in a couple of minutes. So just a short fire comment on this one. I actually just wanted to quickly comment on the thing that the part where the chatbot was suspecting you of hallucinating. Just think about it, everyone. Right? We suspect chatbots of hallucinating. A chatbot suspected that Ross was hallucinating. The flip side of that, which I think is actually fascinating. In 1788. The first fleet arrived in Australia, and one thing that they brought with them to Australia was cats, right? They had cats on ships. Tiny, furry, beautiful creatures that arrived in this new land and triggered the largest extinction event in history. Like so many marsupials have died out because of those creatures. Chatbots, Gen AI, are a bit like that. They're kind of nice, furry, and you sort of...
That was the positive outlook.
What I'm trying to say, look, cats are helpful, even in Australia, right? They kill mice when you keep them in where they're supposed to be, right? And I think that's how we should be thinking about those chatbots as well, that sometimes they're helpful, sometimes they're not. They're like, I use the term alien intelligence, right? Where we just, it's a new species, and we really don't know how to work with this new species. That particular example that you described about your training regime, I think it's a beautiful case that we should start thinking about specialized models, not generic models. You should have a model that helps you with your training plans that will not be doing all those things. Yeah. If you try to build a tool for everything, it will be a tool for nothing, right? And I think that's what we're starting to see with Gen AI.
And we see that currently with, you probably saw how Dario Amodei changed a little bit. He's not talking anymore about general intelligence. He's talking about these ultra specialized models because he realized first that if we make it, if we want to make it acceptable by the population, we should not, we should recognize these risks, but it's also realizing the interesting limitation of that. I mean, and you know that, and I believe that's where Europe also should go. There is this roadblock that has seen Yann Lequin and others that's seeing that this causality, this explanation of why we are asking the question, the context. Some would also talk about world models, their interaction with the real life. This is something where probably LLMs are hitting a sort of a wall. So yes, I agree with you. So the story is not ended at all. It would be very interesting to listen to us in 2 years where probably there will have been some disruption. But what is clear is that the one thing that governments, as recipient of the public good, should do is this should interrogate ourselves on our education system. And my concluding remark would be that's why I'm hopeful for European and I would say enlightened societies is when you think about what enlightenment is, it's not about being more smarter than others and knowing more things than others, but being able to permanently question. And that's where, it's the prompt basically, and that's where our societies need to be better. And that's also, I think, an advantage we have to more authoritarian systems.
Amazing. So that's your takeaway. Other than your takeaway that AIs are cats, Marek, what's one piece of takeaway you'd like to leave our audience?
I wrote a book where in the subtitle I talk about digital minions. You know Minions, the movie. Oh, there's a book. There's a copy here. I like to think about artificial intelligence as a minion from the movie, right? So
who is Kevin?
And a more important, who's Gru, right? Look. Those minions, they want to help us. They really will do whatever we tell them to do. But if we just fully give them our agency and let them do whatever they want, just like in the movie. We look away and disasters start to happen. Super helpful, but we need to stay in the loop.
Awesome. Well, thank you for joining us, Andre, Marek. My name's Russ Wilcox, and I hope you had a great event and continue to have some awesome programming here at the Polish Business Hub, which is one of the best houses in Davos I've seen so far.
One of the best, the best. Thank you.
Thank you, Poland, for the invitation.
Thank you.